Hello, folks. I had Ron here just a moment ago with me. He has gone offline for a second, some technical issue. I imagine he will be back with us in a moment. And so, in the meantime, I will attempt to give an introduction for Ron.
I
Matter of
want
fact,
to.
here he is. So Ron Shelton is is one of the bishops in the Apostolic Celtic Church. When I joined the Apostolic Celtic Church, gosh, I don't remember how many years ago, probably 15 years ago, maybe more. No, probably 15. Um, he was the primus of the church at that time, which in our world is the first among bishops, the person who's responsible for bringing together the other bishops and other leaders in the church for a synod. At different times, it's been once a year. Sometimes it's been every couple of years. And so he was responsible for that and responsible for a big part of my training in the Apostolic Celtic Church. And then at some point, he finally decided to retire from that position. And Bishop Lyle Wilson has been the primus since that time. I think it's been a couple of years.
Yes.
And so, with that being said, I'll let Ron introduce himself and say anything he might want to say or add to the little biography I gave.
Well, first of all, I want to say I appreciate the opportunity to share the little that I do know and to further the understanding of what is the Celtic Church. The Celtic Church, to me, was an answer to a life spent searching, a life of asking questions. One of the early things that a bishop that brought me into the church, Bishop Dillard, would always say is there's nothing wrong with asking questions. If you have questions, ask them, and together we can find the answers and explain. And so that was what really appealed to me, that it's all right to ask questions. I've been brought up in a faith that didn't like questions asked. If you asked questions, you were doubting or casting doubt or casting question on people's minds. So that's tell you a little bit about me. And so I began serving, and as Bishop Chris has said, I got to a point where it was time for me to step down and let somebody else take on the reins and begin the journey, because it can be a very very emotional to lead a group of people. So I stepped down in order for me to be able to do more research and more of my own self studies. So that's where I am right now. So.
Oh, thank you. I imagine our hope for these is that they will be conversations, which, by the way, I know this is live on both YouTube and on Facebook. The software that we're using should filter comments in. So if you put a comment in or have a question that you want me to throw out there, my role in these interviews will be to be the person asking the questions. Ron, my hope for you is that you just kind of think of it like a conversation between the two of us. And that'll make it kind of as natural as we can make it. But for those of you viewing, if you throw questions up there in the comments, I should be able to potentially filter those in and ask some of those questions so that you get to engage in this as well. So with that being said, with kind of the business out of the way, knowing that we're going to have more chances to get to know you because we're going to do more of these, this isn't the only one. Can you start us off by just kind of telling us a little bit, what is the Celtic Church? What makes it unique? What makes it distinctive? Why is it special? You said it stood out to you. Tell us about that.
Well, a lot of times when that question's asked, the response would be, what time period, what location? Because a lot of people, when they refer to the Celtic Church, they're talking about the church that existed in the Britannic Isles before 597 when Augustine arrived. So it just depends on the time period. Some people ask, what is the Celtic Church? And they want to know about the Scottish part of it, or they want to know about the Cornwall, or they want to know about Wales. So it depends on the time period how you respond to some questions. Overview, looking at the whole, the Celtic Church could be summed up in one word: simplicity. Simplicity. It is simple. The Celtic people were very simple people. The Druids' part was very highly educated. The people, everything from jewelry to different types of buildings to different types of construction type structures of their homes, etc. Their arts were very big. They were tribal. So a lot of times when we're talking about the Celtic Church, it depends the tribal area that in the past where it had been set up. But simplicity of life, I believe, is the basic concept of the Celtic Church at a baseline. Simplicity. It's not overly complicated. It's simple way of life, made up of, if you go back to the 1940s, and a lot of people went into the highlands and the back country of Wales, up into the mountainous areas of Wales, and began to write down the traditions and the stories and the prayers that would be said as they stoked the fire in the morning, or as they washed the dishes, or as they milked the cow, or whatever their occupation was. They'd have a little prayer they say. So I would say basically simplicity would be the basis. And it goes back to this concept is, how can we say we love the Creator if we do not love the creation, or demonstrate that we love the creation? So the Celtic faith is a very natural, very simple, very earthy type of faith. Doesn't mean we go out and hug the trees, but it means that we understand that God has created everything around us, and everything contains an essence of Him. Us, animals, the trees, the birds, the streams. And you'll find that if you do a study of the early Celtic saints, they love to go into nature. And Abbot McCrae, who's passed away but lived in upstate New York, he used to go out into nature and have a place to just sit, and as a place of meditation. He would always say, we do too much talking in our prayers. We need to do more listening. So it's more of a meditation. It's more on waiting for a response. And so that's kind of giving you just an over gist of it. And I do apologize. My dog is barking in the background. She's sharing her Celtic beliefs that somebody's at the door or something. I don't know, but anyway. So anyway, that's what I'm kind of talking about. Now, you've pointed out that we're going to do some future little talks, and we can get more specific in different areas. But it's basically a simplicity of life, a simplicity of faith, a simplicity of what does it mean. And different people have different views on what it means to be a Christian. But some would say I'm a believer. They don't like the word Christian because it's been hijacked by, for lack of better terms, I'll just say right wing. It's been hijacked. So a lot of people like Abbot McCrae's group wouldn't say they were Christians. They would say they're of the way, which is a New Testament term that was used to describe Jesus' disciples. And after, in the book of Acts, they were of the way. So that's kind of a simplicity of it.
Yeah, thank you. So, you and I know because we've been in kind of these different spaces, but I wonder, somebody listening, if they're like, what is it? How would I know that I walked into a Celtic church? Like, what would that look like if I stepped into a Celtic church? How do I know that I'm there? What makes the service itself unique?
That right there would go into two areas. It would depend on whether it was a monastic setting with an abbot and a group of, normally in the historical Celtic church, the abbot was elected from within his group. And usually they would be 12 individuals because they're so tied into whatever Jesus would do, they would, for lack of a better term, I could say mimic or follow that tradition. So they would have 12 followers or more, normally be 12. And so if you walked into a monastic group, you would have an abbot who would either do teachings, and they might even have a simplified service, just sitting around meditating, reading the Gospels, singing the Psalms, or others, or locations, or maybe somebody in the group has been during their meditation received from the Lord a song or a chant of some type, and so they would be doing that. Or you would have more of a church-based group, would be led by a local bishop. And so it just depends on which group you go into. But you'd find that the Celtic Church was liturgical because in that day and time, not everybody could read or write. In your monasteries, that's one of the things they would teach, reading and writing. And so the liturgy is what everybody have in common. Because you would just repeat whatever was said, or they'd be repeating together. So it's a very liturgical group, not high liturgical, not as like I would say the Eastern Orthodox Church with all the bells and whistles, or even some of the Latin Roman Catholic groups with the bells and whistles, but a simplicity, just a simple service of gathering around. And usually during that service, the gospel is the main thing. You'll find that most of the ones that are stick closely to the Celtic understanding, mainly their homilies would come out of the Gospels themselves. They'd be talking about what was Christ doing, what did Christ say, what did the disciples, etc. How did he teach his? And that's where the monastic side of the Celtic Church came in, because Jesus took him 12 and set them aside and spent time with them. And if you remember in the book of Acts, I believe it's the book of Acts, where they chose Matthias, one of the requirements had to be somebody that was with Jesus and had heard him speak and heard him teach, etc. So that's where the monastic side of the Celtic Church was. It was gathering a group of people around to introduce them to the faith and teach them the simplicity, teach them what the church was about, and explain to them the faith. And people would be sent out of the monastic side to found the churches. Now in Wales, the church developed in a strongly monastic side, where the abbot would send out someone they would call a bishop. They would consecrate him and send him out to establish a church. And wherever that bishop would go, he would establish a congregation. And that congregation didn't belong to the abbot. It didn't belong to some other bishop. He was the head of that church, and he would do a journey. He'd go on a journey of life. Or as Crocodile Dundee said, let's go on a walkabout. And that's what the Celtic saints would do. They just walk about, and they'd live their life, their faith in their life, every aspect of their life, the simplicity of what they would wear, the simplicity of what how they would live as far as eating, and what they expected to be provided, because they were dependent upon the people, the tribes, the villages that they would come into to host them. Abbot McCrae was very big on that. He always said that a visitor should not stay more than 3 days, but at the end of 3 days, if he's not going to become part of the group, he needs to travel on, because he don't need to become a burden to the location that he's in at that time. So that's kind of giving you, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, and I apologize. No. But that gives you kind of a basic understanding of the faith. The main things they take a copy of the Gospels. It'd either be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or it might be John. John was a very prevalent gospel that the Celtic Church had. Now, a lot of people say, well, what was the translation they used? Well, it was an early Latin translation, earlier than what the Catholic Church Latin Bible is based on now. Is an earlier Vulgate Latin translation, very early. And there are those that have studied, that have spent a lot of time just studying the scripture references that are used in a lot of the old liturgies, and in some of the stories that are told, like if the saint would, it's like St. Patrick, he would say a little something, or St. David or something. They say, well, that's not exactly the way our Bibles read that particular saying that they're quoting from. So there was differences, but they take a gospel with them. They take their staff, because in the Celtic Church, the staff is a sign of authority. It's a sign of authority, not the shepherd's hook like you see with the gold encrusted and the gems and stuff of some church bishops, but it would be just a simple staff, because it had a dual purpose. You never knew when you're going to run into bad people, when you're going to have to maybe defend yourself, wild animals, or it could be used as a tool, as a weapon. It could be used in various aspects, but it was a sign of authority. And you notice that in a lot of, if we ever get to that point, we begin to talk about it, in a lot of the early liturgies that we have pieces of. We don't have a whole liturgy, but we have pieces, and we can deduce from those pieces, get an idea of what the liturgy looked like. And the staff was very important. For a bishop, during a church service, it'd be carried in front of him, not a cross, but the staff, because it was a position of his authority. Whenever Celtic saints would meet one another, sometimes they'd exchange staffs. And these staffs survived down to the what be considered the when the churches were shut down. I think it was Henry VIII. I think it's who it was. Henry VIII really done that and shut down the monasteries. If you didn't quit and go on your way, you got killed. The last abbot of Glastonbury was executed, killed on the Tor Hill, dismembered, literally while he was alive. So if you didn't, but that staff is your position of authority.
Yeah.
So
going back to the liturgy for a moment, you talked about this simplicity, right? And you were kind of separating. There's the ecclesiastical type of service and the monastic type of service, and I know that those can be very different, not just in the way that they structure, like you were talking about the discipleship model that's really kind of set up for the monastic group, but even just the way that a service runs. And so, like, my first time into the Celtic Church, I had never been exposed to liturgy at all. I didn't really know what that meant outside of a couple of places where I went where it seemed heretical because they were venerating these objects and things, and it seemed really surprising. But then I walk into the church for the first time, and there's this giant book, and the priest would say one thing, and then everybody had to respond, and like half or more of all of the people were in robes, and it was very high liturgy, very much like what you might see in a very small Orthodox church. And then at some point when I was in the monastic group and working in one of the churches there, it was much more simple, dressed down version, people sitting in a circle having a conversation. So when you talk about liturgy, what is it that brings them together when you can have such variety within the same church, where you may have a really high church service, you may have a really low mass? What is it that brings this together in the Celtic Church? How do you see both of them? How do you find them both in the same place?
I believe the very basics is that you would have to go back to the liturgy itself, the format of the liturgy, not exactly the words, but the format of the liturgy, because in different parts, different areas, the liturgy would have more of a local flavor. First of all, it was in the vernacular of the local people. It was not Latin. It was not Greek or whatever. It was the vernacular of the local group. And then even the monastic and the church-based group had a structure to it. First of all, you confessed, you professed, and then you received during the Eucharist. For instance, in some groups that I've seen and been a part of, the liturgy, after you receive the sacrament, after you receive the Eucharist, you would then at that time, if you needed prayer or something like that, after you had received, you confessed, professed, received, then they would have a time of prayer where they just saturate you with prayer. It could be a time of silence. It'd be different people would pray at different times. It's just a time of silence. It varied. So there was that format. I believe the format is what really had them both in common.
Right on. And I think we'll talk more about that when we get to the liturgical section of this conversation, which may not end up in this conversation, but one of the future ones. I think it's probably a good time to jump into the first section, though. So we've got the way of life as the first section of our conversation. Celtic theology is the second section, and liturgical pieces is the third section, the third way that we might break out. And it might be that we do one of those each time we meet. So starting with the way of life, you've talked a lot about simplicity. What does it mean for Celtic people to be simple? Like, are we talking about minimalism? Are we talking about the way they view the world? Is it a perspective? What do you mean by simplicity?
I believe it can be a way we view the world. The simpleness in my mind is the fact that it's like looking at a glass. Many people see the glass as being half empty, and then others will see the glass being half full. there's still that potential to put more there. So I believe it's an attitude, first of all, that we see the glass. If we set a glass in front of us being half full, there's still room to add to it. But people take a more of a negative approach. It's half empty, and they look more about what's coming out of it than what's going into it. So that's kind of gives you a basic standard to look at. The simplicity of life is it's just that. It's living. It's how you act, how you treat your neighbor. Who is my neighbor? As in the Old Testament, King asks, "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Celtic Church would say, "Yes, you are. You are. You are responsible for your brother. You're responsible for the way you conduct yourself with them." Who is my neighbor? Your neighbor is anybody that you come in contact with. It could be the butcher at the grocery store. It could be the barber that's cutting your hair. It could be the neighbor outside while you're outside walking your dog. So that concept of living a life before them, that they realize there's something different about you. There's something about you. And that's really what draws people to the Celtic Church. The difference, the attitude, I'm trying to think of a word that might better describe it when my mind's going blank, but just we're demonstrating Christ's love for those that are around us, for nature itself. We're not going to destroy the beautiful trees and the beautiful part of nature that God has created for us. We're going to protect it. We're going to take care of it. Animals, we're not going to be abusive to animals. We're not going to be hateful and stuff like that to our fellow human beings. A lot of people say, "Well, I don't need nobody." Yes, we all need. We are a community, and if you're not part of a community, you're missing something. You don't have anything to depend on, any person to depend on. A community comes together out of a common bond, which is a love for God and a love for one another.
You've talked to me before about the value that Celtic Christians have on education, and I know that there's kind of a rich tradition of education here. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, looking through history, no matter which group and which time period, you'll find that they valued education, but not education that throws the faith out, but education that embraces the faith and lives that faith. Education, they were very highly, for their time and for their areas, depending on what time period, were educated. They wasn't just just anybody. They believed in training. They would hook you up with an animakara, someone that was your soul friend, somebody that you could spend time with, someone that could direct you, someone that could invest in your life. And I think that's one thing that all of us need to try to do in the Celtic faith, to invest in others what we have learned or what we have come to know, to invest in them our time. One thing when I was a manager, I said I'd always give people the time to do what they need to do, the training to do what they need to do, and the tools to do what they need to do. And I believe in the Celtic faith, those three things are the same things that we need to invest in people's lives so that they can develop and go out into the world and live their faith and minister to people. We're called to serve. We're not called to be served. We're called to serve others. We're like Christ did. He knelt down and he took water and he washed the disciples' feet. Remember, Peter got offended by it. And there's people that get offended by it, but just not the ones that are doing the serving, because they think somebody else needs to be serving them, washing their feet. But when Jesus was doing that to his disciples, and then Peter realized that Peter was very outspoken many times, and he goes, "Well, Lord, don't just wash my feet, wash all of me." And the Lord said, "Peter, you don't need that right now. We just need to get the dust off your feet." That was a very symbolic thing, because when you go into a Jewish home, your feet would be washed by the servant to clean off the dust from the journey. You take your sandals off. And so that's very symbolic, I believe, of how we are to treat one another. I hope I've kind of answered that question a little bit.
Yeah, so like a value in education is not just like going to school, but it's about embodying that. It's more of a wisdom tradition than it is, education in the way that we tend to think of it. Am I hearing that right?
It's just not facts. It's how you fulfill what you know to be the fact. That is what's needed. And I'm afraid a lot of people that are religiously educated are missing that. Oh, they can quote the catechism, they can quote the creeds, but they don't know the essence of it, which is living a life enriched, helping, serving others. And that's what they're missing. That's what they're really missing.
Yeah. You've also talked to me a little bit on this one around the idea that the Druidic schools at some point got taken over and became the older forms of I guess a preliminary to a seminary.
There's been a lot of comment about that through those that have studied the available writings, the understanding of the different time periods in the church history of the Britannic Isles, what that represented. And so I would say that the Celtic people were divided by tribes. And you will find that, especially in Wales, very tribal, in Scotland too, but let's still with Wales a little bit, that each tribe would designate an area to be used for religious purposes. And so it was very tribal. The abbot would be from that tribe. The individuals that were being trained would be from that tribe, and they'd go out among the people of that tribe. And then Scotland is very tribal too. I remember Abbot McCrae talking about how, and it sounds kind of, we would think of it today and we'd laugh about it, but he wouldn't go eat at McDonald's because sometime in the history of his group, his tribe, his clan, the McDonald's had wiped them out, almost just utterly destroyed them, and betrayed them and left them on the field of battle or attacked them. And so there's that clannishness, and you'll find that a lot of the people that came to America in the early 1700s brought those tribes, those clans with them, and so we got to understand, and it's different from how we are in America today. We're not very family. We're we move. We don't stay around to where our family is. But in that time period, and for those people, they stayed connected to their clan, their family, their tribe, however you want to, whatever name you want to use. But education was very important to know not just the facts, but how to present the life, how to talk about nature and the service of God. And these early Celts believed in a life after death. They believed in it. So it wasn't hard for them to accept a lot of the teachings of the faith. It wasn't hard for them to accept it. Kind of was embodied in their understanding of their faith. In fact, if you go back and look at, today there's a book written called The Lost Church, The Lost Churches. And in that book, it goes back and it talks about churches before they were rock or block built. They were hewn of wood. And so usually they were built in the areas that were called the oak groves. And the oak groves is where the Druidic religious rituals would take place. Well, when they become Christianized or become of the faith, they would build their church in that location. Then when the Normans come along, they begin to build rock buildings. The churches developed that way, and so you kept them in the same location. So let's say, for instance, right now, if you could go to the Highlands of Scotland and go back to some of they're just remnants of what they were, but there'll be small oratories, small chapels, small churches that were standing alone. They was in places where they were of a spiritual understanding. Abbot McCrae was very big on the thin places where we can see into the other world, where they can see us and we can see them. So that's the type of background of the people. They were very close, very clannish, and you stayed within your tribe or within your clan. You didn't venture out, but everybody was doing the same thing. All the tribes that was introduced to the faith, because it spoke to the heart of being Celtic, the love of nature, the love of creation, the love of life. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but the early Celts you would only kill somebody if it's really, I mean, it had to really be bad. And then it wasn't just something handed down locally. They would, because these Druids were cross tribal boundaries. And so if they had to be a death, or they felt like death was called for, it had to go to the highest ranks of the Druidic structure to be decided upon. And then it was pushed back down. So it wasn't, life was valuable. Life was considered, your creator created you the way you are and gave you the abilities to do what you're doing. So they really put a lot of their belief system into that. And so when Christianity come on, the early Christianity, not some of the stuff we have today, but the early faith, the way, it spoke to something deep within them, and they responded to it.
Yeah. You talk about this this love and respect they have for life. And I know that there's also this part of Celtic tradition that is a love and respect for nature. I wonder if you could talk about that.
I believe the overview is what I said at the very beginning. How can you say that you love the Creator and not love His creation? If you love the Creator, you're going to demonstrate that love, that by your actions, by what you say, by what you do. So it's a simplicity of that. And the stories that were told by these early Celts that were converted to the faith or the way, it spoke to them in a very, very strong way, just not on a level of the outside of the skin. It got within them. It spoke to their very understanding that they were created by God. They were a spark of God. God, when He created, put the essence of Himself into everything. And we just have to fan that flame. Some people, the flame has almost been snuffed out. And so we have to fan that flame. But there's a spark of God within all of us, of the essence of God as our creator. He has made us. He has created us. And we are to be His hands, His feet, His voice, His help for other people. And so that is such a, and I don't believe anybody can really get the words to describe how that really feels. And I can feel it within me as I begin to talk about it. And it brings a tear to my eye. It kind of makes me, I can't explain it, just down deep inside. And that's really what the faith is about. It's not these outward just words that we say. It's how we live. What is within you will come out. If you get to talking to people, it won't take long before what's in their heart will come out by what they say. In the same way of the Celtic faith, it won't take long for you to get around somebody and you'll know whether they're really serious about it by how they conduct themselves, what they say, their actions. Not that they're making those actions, but it's a natural way of living by treating your neighbor, treating the creation of God. Now, when I get off course a little bit, just recorrect me a little bit, because I'm liable to go off on a rabbit trail if I'm not very careful. I can feel that coming up in me. But it's just, the Celtic people were very spiritual people. I mean, they were very, very spiritual people, very spiritual people. So a lot of the practices that the faith brought in were accepted by them because they were already doing them. They would go out into nature and they'd meditate. Now they might be worshiping the oak tree or worshiping some type of God, but they had an understanding. And so today, that essence that's within us makes us want to, mankind's going to worship something. People say, I don't worship nothing. They're lying. Everybody worships something. It's within our nature to worship something bigger than us, to believe or to want to believe that there's something bigger than what we are. There is a divine purpose. Even for people who don't go to church, don't believe in all that stuff, down deep inside, they believe in something. They really do.
You bring up a good point with this, like a moment ago, you were talking about, people going out and worshiping the oak tree, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes people hear the title, Celtic Church, and they're like, oh, these must be, witches that are pagans, witches and pagans that are going out dancing naked in the woods, and
Yeah.
and they're worshiping nature. And I think that there's something different that's happening. It's not worship of nature. It's something different. I wonder if you could talk about that.
You got me thinking. You got me thinking about dancing naked. If you remember David Galbraith,
Yeah.
who was a very good friend, and we were like brothers. We'd fuss and fight and argue over stuff and discuss. We call it discussion, but most people think we was arguing because we'd have heated discussions on topics, and then when we got done, we'd say, "Well, where do you want to go eat?" We'd go eat together because we'd like brothers. But he used to say, if they really knew who we were, they would not want to see us dancing naked around trees, around the woods. So anyway, just that's why I started laughing when you started talking about that. What was your question again? I got sidetracked there.
It's essentially that some people. They hear the title Celtic Church and they think that, oh, we must be pagans worshiping, the trees, and there's a respect for the trees, but there's something different. It's not worship. I wonder if you could talk about that distinction between the love we have of nature and this idea that we might worship it.
Nature is not the God. Nature is the creation of God, and we are. Just like the story of Adam and Eve, they were put to till, to take care of, to nourish. I can't think of the correct words there, but the Celtic people had a high reverence for the nature that was around them. And now the pagan part of the Celtic church, now the Celtic, not church, but the early pagans, and there are even some groups today that continue in Wales and Scotland. There's still pagan groups that do pagan rituals and pagan sacrifices. They still have. I was introduced to a guy through Bishop Stalker, who still he had a pagan group. He had a gold knife, and they'd climb up an oak tree and cut out mistletoe, and they still done a lot of those pagan things. They kept those alive. I would say for the church, it's more respect of what God has created and given to us. He gave us the earth and the bounty of the earth, and for us to take care of and to help for our future generations to survive. And I'm probably not really hitting what you're getting at. And if I'm not, just redirect me again, Chris. I apologize. As we get older, our minds are not as sharp as what they once were. As somebody said, a story is told about two men sitting in the living room, and one of the guys said to the other guy, he said, "Do you remember that guy's name that we used to know in school, and that girl he used to date, blah, blah, blah?" And the one looked at the other and says, "What's that flower that has the thorns on it?" And the guy goes, "Rose." And the guy goes, "Hey, Rose, there in the kitchen. What was that guy's name we went to school with?" So, that's kind of, sometimes we got to be continually have somebody asked or get more specific with the question to keep us on course. I do apologize. But there are groups that still practice those. I'll give you an example. What I believe was a descendant of the Scots-Irish that came into the mountains of western North Carolina. My great-grandmother used to, she would have been burned at the stake as a witch, to be honest with you, if it had been in that time period. Because if somebody got cut, they would come to her, and she'd use herbs, and she'd say what we used to call as little kids a little ditty. She'd say a little thing over it. And it wasn't, and for a long time, it wasn't normal English being said. But come to find out, what we believe today is what she was saying was a form of Welsh or Scottish language that they picked up when they were trained by their mother or their grandmother of how to stop bleeding. And through the generations, we come to think of it just gibberish, but actually, if we traced it back, it was a Welsh or Scottish word, Gaelic, actually being used when they say the prayers. So there is that, even in western North Carolina. In the Appalachian Mountains, there are traditions that are Celtic in origin. There are thin places within a mile or two of where I live right here that are called thin places, that people know there's spiritual places that you can go there and meditate. And it's like it's like having an antenna on the old TV. Most people today don't know what that is, but getting that tuning in, you can go to those thin places and you have a better connection with the other world, as it was referred to.
So you've brought up you've brought up thin places a couple of times.
Yes.
Tell me more about that. What is the thin place?
Thin places can go all the way back to the Old Testament, when the children of Israel would go to a place and they would pray or they would worship God. They would erect a stone as a symbol. That was a place of man meeting God. And if you go back and you study the locations where these stones have been found in the Britannic Isles and even in America, you'll find out that they were of religious significance, sometimes predating the faith. They were significant in that they were a place known to where you could go and spend time alone with God, and God would speak to you and God would communicate with you. And it was like carrying on a conversation. And so these were places where, and a lot of the pagan part of it comes out in Halloween, where the spiritual world and the world we live in interconnect and they cross over. It's a thin place. It's a place that is usually of a very strong religious significance, and it can be for the individual family or the individual tribe or the individual itself. We could tell some of the stories from the Old Testament. We could tell some of the early Celtic stories where they had these places where they met God, where they talked with God, where Abraham was sitting in his tent and God showed up in the form of a human form. So these are places where man and God could pass back and forth. The understanding was, and that's a very simple way of looking at it. But it's a holy place. It's a place where God met you. It's like there was a minister in Virginia and North Carolina. He wrote a circuit known as Sheffey. And Sheffey had a place where he'd go and pray, where he'd meet with God. And that same place on his circuit of churches he'd go to preach, he'd always stop at that place because that was the first place where he met God. Or for instance, Abraham, for instance, Isaac, where they met God at a particular place. And so these thin places, they became historical places where tribes would come back to. And I'll give you an example. I may be mispronouncing the name, but the place is in Turkey. It is a religious location, Tipi something. I can't pronounce the name. I can't remember fully. But it's a place where the nomadic people would travel, but they would come back to at certain times of the season, certain times of the year, as a place of worship where they'd come together. So we find these places, and we have them today. Some people love to go to the church and when it's light, when there's nobody there, and go to the altar area, just spend time quietly sitting there. And I've heard people actually out loud talk to God and just sit there. The story I heard this week was of Charles Stanley. Charles Stanley was born in a Pentecostal family, but he became Baptist. But his way of doing it, he had a prayer closet he'd go in, get to. And when this Baptist minister that came to work with him was telling that story of how they went to that prayer closet, Charles Stanley got down on his knees. So he got down on his knees. Charles Stanley laid prostrate on the floor. He laid prostrate on the floor. Charles Stanley began to pray. He said a prayer. And then they'd be quiet. Then Charles Stanley would say, "Oh, ooh, yes, Lord, yes." And that Baptist minister is on his staff say, "Oh, yes, Lord, yes." He just repeating whatever but Charles Stanley that was his thin place. He actually had a room built where he'd go into and just pray, just meditate, say something and listen, wait to God, just lay there an hour, 2 hours, whatever it took to meet God. So these thin places were places where we come in contact with God, and we can have places ourselves. Evan McCrae had a place on his farm that he called the thin place, and he took me to it. And I'll be honest with you, he didn't have to tell me that was where it was. When you got close to it, make the hair on the back of your head start standing up. You for lack of a better term, your spiritual part would begin like a the flicker, the light would kind of, whoo, you know. And I mean, I'm not trying to be crazy about it, but you could feel something. And we're human beings. We're based on emotions. And the Celtic people were very emotional people. If you don't believe it, you read some of the stories about them going into battle or how they would do things. They were very emotional people. They believed, the Celtics throughout the history of the Celtic Church believed in healing. They believed in the power of prayer. They believed it. You didn't have to ask them. They demonstrated. So when I went with McCrae and he showed me that place, you could feel it. Now, Bishop Dillard had a place which was a study in his house, and you go sit in that room, and you could feel there was something different about that room because he had spent time in that room, sitting there, meditating, hearing God for the direction he was to go. And that's something we need to train people to do. We think prayer, and I used to joke because sometimes we'd say, while they catch up on their prayer life, we're going to go ahead and go on with the service or something like that. Because some people it's just words to them. They just, God is in this holy place. You know, they say all this fluffy stuff. No, it can be, Lord, help me. Lord, show me. And it's like that old, and God showed up. Remember on Forrest Gump? And God showed up. And so, but it's serious. It's a place where we can go and spend time alone and hear and talk.
I want to highlight one of the things you just said too that really points to that simplicity showing up in another place. That simplicity of prayer. That prayer is not just a bunch of words, but it's this thing that can just be a couple simple words.
And sometimes when we are overwhelmed with life and there's so much going on, it could be a death, it could be a marital problem, it could be our health problem, that we can be so overwhelmed that we cannot even utter the words. But the scriptures tell us that our spirit groans. And the Spirit also talks about nature groans. Nature remembers. There's a remembrance in nature. Don't ask me how that is. And I know you're going to think I'm crazy, and you probably think I'm a pagan, and that's fine if you do. When we get to heaven, it'll all be straightened out. Don't worry about it. But there's a connection there that nature itself groans. Nature wants to be back in that complete fellowship where everything is right. There's no more thorns and thistles. There's no more death. There's no more despair, no more destruction. Nature wants that. We want that. Within us, there's that. We want to return to God who has created us. And we will. But it's just there's something within us that beckons. It beckons us. It speaks to us in such a powerful way that it can overwhelm our senses. We can begin to cry. We can begin. Some people groan. Some people just, you hear it in the crackling of their voice or the sighs that they say. When we are so overwhelmed, that's when God steps in. And see, we so many times, and I know I may be preaching to the choir, so don't get mad at me, Chris, but so many times we're going to overcome stuff by the force of our will. And that's not how it's going to be done. It's not the force of our will. It's that faith that deep down inside of us that we know that our Creator created us. And He didn't create no junk. He didn't create no trash. He created something wonderful, something. I'm reminded of the 2001 Space Odyssey. Wonderful. He created something wonderful of us, within us, that beckons to us and calls us back to a simple way of life. When the world is wars and rumors of wars and stress and economy and loss of jobs, and we just have to get back to sitting there and saying, God, I don't understand. I don't understand why my parents have had to die. I don't understand that. But I know, God, that they've returned to you. God, I don't know why I'm going through this marital issue. I don't know why I'm going through this health issue. But God, there's a purpose in all things. All things. The good, the bad, and the ugly. There's a purpose there. And we in our life, we just have to find that purpose. And sometimes we will not know that purpose until we go back to God. And somebody said that's what going back to God is all about, saying, give me the answer of why. But it's that connection. It's you're overwhelmed with emotions. And I'm about to cry now thinking about it. Just that connection to our God, just that connection. It means so much to us. And a lot of people, even religious people that are big in the church, they won't understand what you're talking about. But that's what being Celtic's all about, having that connection, that understanding, that feeling. Sometimes you can't describe it, but you know it. You know that's where they go and pray. You know that's where they go and meditate. You just know it when you walk in an area. You know it. You can feel it. You can get around people that you know that are very, you'd call them very mystical, very mystic people. You can tell by just being around them. Your spirit and their spirit, they bear witness with one another. You know that there's a connection there, that they know what you're talking about. Even if you don't have the words to describe it, they know what you're talking about.
Yeah. I want you to go back because you kind of started to wrap yourself around and talk back about these thin places. And I noticed that when you were talking about the thin places, the way you describe it is different than what you would hear in pagan circles. People who would necessarily describe like, oh, the thin places are these places where astrological things align in just the right way, and because they align in just the right way, it's a thin place because of that, and it's an external thing, right? But when you talk about thin places, you talk about how the pressing in that a person can do in that space, as they press into the divine in that space, it makes that space holy. And there's some type of sanctification that happens in the world in the way that it happens within us when it's saturated in prayer. I've noticed it myself when I go to like a monastic community. It's been saturated in prayer for so many years by so many different people, and it's just this awe. And it doesn't matter whether it's a magnificent building or, I've been in ones that were little shacks that were just like falling apart, but you could still feel that feeling you describe. And so there's something unique about this way that we can just press into the divine and make that space holy in some way.
I want to first of all say this. Us as human beings need to have that place that we can press in. If you don't have a place where you can press in, it's like having an electric car and not having no place to plug it up to get its power. If you don't have a place where you can press in, if you're listening to this, you need to find that place and press in. That needs to be a place that you can go and be rejuvenated, reborn, for lack of a better term, but that you need that place. I believe that mankind within itself, within ourselves, have this understanding that we need to worship something bigger than ourselves. We really do. And some people worship their education. They say they're agnostic or whatever. They're worshiping their education. Some people worship science. So pagans have picked this up, that in a lot of places that in the past pagans have considered strong spiritual places for them because the stars align. Later on, you'll find that the Celtic people or other groups of people have taken their religion and laid it on top of that location. But what I'm talking about is where we have a place. We have developed that place, and it could be various reasons, various causes of why we chose that area. Some areas are historical places you can go to, and you can feel. For example, I'm going to throw out an example. If you go to Glastonbury today, there's only a few ruins left. But you know where the altar area is, because when you get to that area, you feel a presence that you cannot explain. I've been there. You can feel a presence that you cannot explain. And then you see this very little sign, like a 5x7 card. It says, this is where the altar area was of Glastonbury Cathedral or Glastonbury Abbey. And so you can go to places that have historically been spiritual places for pagans, and then the faith was laid over top of it and it continued on. Or you can have places where we as individuals, what I normally talk about is places where we as individuals can go of our own choosing to press in, to spend time with the divine. I'm afraid we don't spend the time like we should. And that's why we feel That's why we don't understand when things are going on around us. There are people today that they feel like they've been a failure because they don't have the largest church or the largest monastic group. If you just have one person that you are investing your time in, that's worth more than anything else in the world for you as an individual to invest in another person. That's one of the things that was handed down to me in the church side strongly was to find someone to invest your time, your understanding, what you have been taught, to invest in them and to let them blow. Now, some people say, well, how do I know they're the people? Well, it just happens. But you can invest in people. So we need to be investing in a place where we take time to hear from God, a place where we can go and be rejuvenated, reborn, gassed up, whatever you want to call it. And then it's a place where we can just go and spend time, because there are times in our lives that we go through horrendous times. I mean, think back in our own lives, the things we've been through at times and how we got to where we are today. So it's very important, those 10 places. So yes, as you were saying, some places are based on the alignment of the stars, their understanding of things, their understanding of nature. Oak groves, where these oak trees where they'd go and worship, different places like that. There's also something about Yule trees in some parts of the Britannic Isles where the Yule trees planted where there's churches, and the Yule trees can be much older than the church is located there. So these are all places that were chosen for various reasons. And our place can be a place that pagans had used. There's nothing wrong. The Cherokee Indians had holy places here in Western North Carolina. And then what do you call the people today that I call them the spiritualists have kind of adapted those places. Where David and Jerry Galbraith used to live, there was the house mountain there lived on, that was considered a thin place. And they would still have gurus or whatever you want to call them, groupies come to hang out on the mountain just because they've been told the stories. So there are those places. There are places that are physical locations decided by the alignment of the stars, but there's also those places where you and we build a presence.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that the early Celtic saints would do. They would make a presence. They would go on their walkabout, for lack of a better term. And when they decided they was going to build a church or build a monastic location, they would bless that area. They would walk it like they'd be like oxen were used to plow. They just walk that area, and they'd saturate it with prayer. And as the Spirit would move them, they would decide, all right, now most of the early Celtic churches, the altar was always facing the east, where the people were looking east. Because in the Celtic church, or the Celtic understanding of things, instruction came from the east. So the priest, the bishop, the abbot would always be seated in the east, and people would face them looking into the east. And for a lot of Bible people to understand the Bible, when Christ returns, he will return in the east. Now, that's been hijacked too and made to be some kind of secret, kind of like a crazy, it is a wild story, but he is going to return in the east. And so the churches face these, the monastic settings where they face the east. So it's a spiritual understanding. And the Celts understood that it wasn't just something they had to be taught. It was something they just grew up. They knew it. They knew they had to bless the ground. They would say a blessing over the seeds they were planting. They blessed the fields. They would, the home before they start building it. And, there's all these, like when somebody builds a house, they nail a kind of some type of a pine type tree where it's good all through the winter and summer too. But there's a pagan understanding, but there's also the faith side of that. There's all this, it kind of intermingles at times.
So I see that our time is kind of at an end, but this last question, I just feel like it's so important that this is a part of the conversation around Celtic as a way of life, that it's worth going over for a few minutes if you've got a couple minutes for it. Is that all right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So my understanding of the Celtic tradition and some of the stories that you've told me, there's this idea of living as a sacrament. And one of the ways that you used to explain this to me is you talked about how, there was a prayer when they would light the fire in the morning, and there was a prayer when they would wash their hands, and it became a meaningful part of my journey when I started to kind of press into that and started to create like a prayer when I took a shower in the morning, when I washed my hands, and it started to ingrain itself in the rhythm of my daily life. And so I wonder if you could talk just a little about that.
Well, the one thing what you're talking about is after a while, the faith becomes such a part of you that everything you do for a purpose of service, a purpose of helping others, and it's taught to you. Now, if you wait to older in life, it's harder to learn all those ways. But if you start off as a child learning that when you go out to milk the cow, there's a prayer you say, or when you go out to feed the chickens, there's a prayer that you say, or when you get the fire started early in the morning, there's a prayer that you say. You are literally saturating your life with prayer. It becomes, and it's a instructional tool at some points in your life. It is. I can't think of the exact words I want to use here. It is being through demonstrating God's presence in everything we do. A lot of people have this concept in religion that God doesn't see everything we do or know what we do. He does. We may think we're hiding stuff, but we're not. We may think that, so it's important that we ingrain into us the understanding that every aspect of our lives needs to demonstrate in some form or fashion that spark of the divine that is within us. I wish I could tell stories the way Abbot McCrae would tell stories. I mean, or Bishop Stalker. I'm just not that gifted in that area. But if you hear the stories, for some reason, the Celtic people are very storytelling. They tell stories, and those stories they don't forget. They forget the Battle of McLeod, and they don't forget those things. They don't forget how in the year 1400 something happened, or in the year 700 something happened. It is taught to them over and over and over again, and the stories are just kept alive. I wish I could tell the stories that way. It just is Stalker or McCrae too. They could just start off with a story, and they'd tell you 5 stories, and at the end they'd come back around to the story they're talking to you now about, and it perfectly makes sense. So the thin places are important. This simplicity of the gospel itself is important. The allow it to become a way of life for us, not just something on a Sunday that we do or when we go to a particular building to come together as a group, but it's a way of life. It's a way of living. It's a way of of uh, of, of fanning that spark of God that is within us. And I probably haven't answered that question. I don't think I have, but let me dwell on that a little longer, and we'll talk again about that.
Yeah. I'll add this too, just kind of from my own formation on that one, that the simple prayers, those little prayers that you say while you wash your hands or do different things, like one of the biggest things that they did for me was they brought awareness to the presence of God in the simple things. And they brought an awareness to how the simple things can be done in a way that is worship. That when you slow down to do a prayer when you wash your hands, you start to think about like, how is God in this hand washing? And then you start to think about like, oh, my body is the temple of God. And then you start to think like, oh, like I can do this in a way that is worship. And there's something beautiful about that.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
All that being said, we're at the end of our time. We will do this again. So our plan for everybody watching, and that will watch this in the future, is to do one of these a month, and to try to capture some of the wisdom that Ron has, and get that on video so that we can all gain something from that. I know that I have been formed by it, so I want to make sure that that's shared with other people. Anything that you want to say in closing before we hop off here?
Stay close to your Creator. Stay close to the Creator. Get so close that you can walk outside and you can just hear Him. Stay close.
Thank you. All right, for folks online, we'll see you around.